Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. After several tragic mass shootings this week across South Carolina, Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott joins us to discuss what can be done to better protect the citizens of the state. And the Associated Press's Meg Kennard gives an update on the death penalty and 2 potential executions. But first, more from this week. In the State House this week, both chambers were back in action as the final day of session is now 3 weeks away, and controversial bills dealing with critical race theory, a transgender student-athlete ban, medical marijuana, and a popular early voting bill, as well as the budget, are competing for action and attention by May 12th. On Wednesday evening, the Senate passed an early voting bill that also strengthens elections, but not before senators amended the bill to give themselves more oversight over the State Election Commission, something House Republicans, Democrats, and the governor oppose.
There's no oversight at all. Right? What we're asking for is nothing new. It's not abnormal. This is not usurping power from the governor. I mean, look, y'all know me. Those of you who've been here for a while, you've heard me argue about different things. I mean, I'm not going to usurp power from the governor. I'm usually the one who's wanting to give more power to the governor. But I do think that a check and balance is important. Right now, there is no check.
Senators say they've been bullied into having to approve the House's version of the bill. With temperatures heated over this broadly supported bill, it's a wonder what else could be impacted in the final legislative days, like the Senate-approved medical marijuana bill.
And did you know that I'm going through that right now with S-150, the medical marijuana bill, where majority of the members, are looking to leadership, and leadership, I've observed firsthand, has tremendous sway over what the members do. Were you aware of that?
That conservative bill would allow those with certain medical conditions the ability to use marijuana oils, salves, patches, and vaporizers, while burning leaf would still remain illegal. This week, House members debated a bill that prevents teachers from teaching that one race, sex, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is inherently superior to another, is inherently privileged or oppressive, that an individual should be discriminated against because of those immutable characteristics, or that they bear responsibility for past actions. House Democrats filed hundreds of amendments to the bill that they say will curtail the teaching of African American history.
So we're trying to give these individuals no pathways to success by removing some of their history. Y'all should be ashamed of yourself trying to put this on our young people. You should absolutely be ashamed of yourself. And I'm hurting right now because we just lost 3 young people. Every day I'm dealing with young people who are dying because they don't know who they are. They don't know where they come from. I had to look mine up on 23.com, 23andMe. I had to look mine up to figure out that I was 44% Nigerian. I bet some of y'all know exactly you came from Ireland or England, Europe. I have no idea where I come from. We should be ashamed of ourselves trying to limit the access to education for our young people. Absolutely ashamed.
The bill will still need to go through the Senate, which hasn't taken up any such legislation this year, and will be on the budget next week. Joining me now to discuss the recent mass shooting in Columbia is Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott. Sheriff Lott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sheriff, let's just start first off with the latest information about that shooting at Columbiana Mall on April 16th. Can you tell us what happened there and the latest information you have?
Well, the 3rd arrest was made, so I think we've got all 3 people arrested that was involved. And this goes back to a 2018 murder that we had in the lower Richland area. And the people involved are still been at each other, and unfortunately they ran into each other at the mall this past weekend and decided they'd continue the feud that they had from 2018 and engage in a shootout. And we got a lot of innocent people hurt at Columbiana Mall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 9 people struck by gunfire, 6 injured in the panic. What were your initial thoughts when you heard that call come in? What did you think could possibly have been going on at that moment?
Well, it's an active shooter. You're just scared to death that you've got someone that's in there doing a mass shooting. It turned out that was not the case. It wasn't just a person in there shooting unarmed persons. It was somebody in there that knew each other, but instead of shooting each other, they ended up getting innocent people shot. And that's what we tend to see sometimes when people like this engage in gunfire and in a gunfight in a crowded area.
Mm-hmm. And how often are we seeing these mass shooting events? I know you've been on the force for decades and you've been around the state, of course. What's your perception on how these mass shootings are occurring in our state, the prevalency of them?
Well, we're seeing more and more across the United States. This was the first one that we've had like this in Richland County and the Midlands of Columbia. But across the United States, we're almost hearing about them weekly, where there's a mass shooting. And sometimes it's a gunman just goes in and shoots people that don't know. Sometimes it's someone that goes in and has a target but ends up shooting other people besides the target they're actually after.
And what are you guys doing, your force right now, doing to really kind of prepare for these moments? I know you work really hand in hand with the Columbia Police Department and other agencies. How do you train for this? How do you prepare for these moments?
Well, high visibility. We encourage anywhere where there's a lot of people going to be, if it's a festival or something outside, or even the mall, have high visibility of uniformed police officers there. That's one of the greatest deterrents, is having a uniformed officer present and having a lot of them. And so when the bad guys see that, then they say they're not going to do it in front of a cop. And so that high visibility is one of the things that we try to work on as much as we can with different organizations.
And sir, going back to this shooting, like you said, 2 individuals were arrested, then a third just turned themselves in this morning. It's Thursday morning, we're taping this. They've been charged with attempted murder and felony assault. Do you feel that these charges are sufficient? They're also not being granted bond at this time. How do you feel that things are shaping up right now in this process?
I think the criminal justice system's working. They're being charged appropriately. I hope it's only attempted murder. I hope we don't have anyone die from the injuries that they had from last weekend. So I think that very serious charges, and I think that our system, our criminal justice system now is going to take this very seriously and hopefully send a message to people that this is not going to be tolerated.
What about some criticism you hear from maybe some on the right who complain about seeing Democratic-led cities or counties or police departments or sheriff's departments saying that they're weak on law, that they're not strong on law and order issues? How do you respond to that? Have you heard any of that criticism in the past, and how do you handle that?
No, I haven't heard any criticism directed at Richland County Sheriff's Department or any of our agencies here in the Midlands of Columbia. They know that we take a tough stance on crime, and this is not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue. This is a community issue, and we need to put politics aside and just do the right thing and protect our people.
And Sheriff Lott, talk to me about what needs to be done here, because even this week after this mass shooting, we saw a separate mass shooting on Easter Sunday, early in the morning, Sunday down Hampton County, obviously not your jurisdiction, but we saw another shooting on Wednesday here with 3 teenagers. One of them died, 2 in serious condition. How do we address this? What needs to be done at the community level, maybe the police department level? What do you see needing to be done?
The first thing to realize, it's not a law enforcement problem. This is a community problem. Until we address it as a community, we're going to continue to have this. We just got young people who think a gun is the answer to everything they have, any problem they have, any disrespect they get. Conflict resolution doesn't exist with them except with a gun. And so we got to change the minds and the hearts of our young people and let them know a gun's going to get them 1 or 2 places, a cemetery or in prison. They're bombarded by media and music, and their heroes all glorify violence. Look at the games they play, either blowing something up or shooting something. So from an early age, our young people are just completely indoctrinated that, a gun or weapon is how you solve any problem they have. And we need to teach them that that's not right. We need to teach them what the real world is about, that when you shoot someone, you don't push a button and they get up and start over again. We got to start at home, but then if they don't get it at home, and we've always heard it takes a village to raise a child. I think our village is our community, and we need to step up now and work together more than we ever have.
And when we see these shootings, Sheriff, where are these guns coming from? Are they legally obtained? Are they illegally obtained? What's the breakdown like when you see these crimes?
Most of these guns are coming from gun owners who leave their guns in their vehicles and leave their vehicles unlocked. Young people go through neighborhoods at night and just open car doors or truck doors and go in and search, and people leave their weapons there. And majority of the guns that we see used in these crimes are just gun owners who are not responsible gun owners and leave them in their car. And our teenagers get their hands on them, and then they use them to shoot people. And then they trade the gun off and they use it in another shooting. So we can stop that as a community. We got to be careful where we have our guns, make sure we're responsible gun owners, leave our vehicles locked all the time. Do not ever leave them unlocked. We just got to protect our weapons, and that'll keep them from getting in the hands of these teenagers.
And this week, Columbia Senator Dick Harpootlian said on the Senate floor that he wanted to see tougher gun laws take place in the state, increase our what's going on with the laws on the books already, including making unlawful carrying a felony with mandatory prison time. Do you think that that's necessary? Do you see any legislative remedy for this situation right now?
Yeah, I do think it's necessary. Senator Harpootlian called me before he went on the Senate floor that day, and we discussed it. So, yeah, we need to put some teeth in our laws. Right now, you can get caught unlawfully carrying a gun 10 times, and it's all first offense. So we have to hold people accountable more than what our laws have now. So I think changes in our laws are very necessary because we're in a crisis right now. We're losing too many young people. That 14 to 28 age group is our target group that we're having so many problems with.
And that's something that, again, is something that you say the community needs to be a part of. Is there any active programming going on with the Sheriff's Department and community organizations, or what do you see? How does that kind of mesh together? What role does the Sheriff's Department play?
Well, we help facilitate some of this stuff. Unfortunately, we got too many groups that are in it for their own motivation and not for saving our kids. So we need to pull people together that really want to work and save our kids. So we're helping do that. There's some organizations that we're working with. We're trying to get everybody on the same page. Nobody has the answer. No one program is the answer. But when we put all these heads together and come up with a good program, then we'll be very successful with it.
And Sheriff, we have about 3 minutes left. I want to ask you about crime rates in general in the state. SLED produced a report last year for 2020, the most recent data available, showing that, we've been seeing aggravated crimes jumping. We saw murders jump to 552 in 2019, I believe, and also just, a wide variety of crimes jumping up. What do you see fueling this? How do you address this? And what's it like here in Richland County?
Well, our property crimes have been reduced. Where we saw a drastic increases in violence. And again, that's young people with guns. Our shootings, our fatal shootings and our non-fatal shootings. We've had well over 150 people shot in the Midlands of Columbia who didn't die. If we didn't have great medical services, we'd have lost more people. We had 32 murders in Richland County alone last year, and that's a big increase than we've had before. So our increase and our focus has got to be on violent crime, and that's people with guns. All the other crimes have been reduced. People breaking into houses, breaking into businesses, stealing, except for stealing guns out of cars. Everything else has been reduced. It's the violent crimes that is driving our problems that we've got right now.
And Sheriff, what about the state of policing in Richland County right now? We've seen, there've been a lot of discussions over the years about tactics, funding, and in some places there have been some fraught community relations. What is the Richland County Sheriff's Office experiencing right now when it comes to dealing with these issues, the community level, and also maybe recruiting and what it's like to be a police officer in 2022?
We're having no problems. We're getting lots of young people who want to be in this job. And our relationships with the community have been great because we've been building that foundation for years and years. You don't build a relationship during a crisis. So we reach out to all of our communities. Richland County is very diverse. And it's up to us to go to these different communities and build that relationship, build that bridge with them. And one of the first things you have to do is your agency has to reflect the community we serve. And so we do that. We reflect that diversity in Richland County. So we have great support from our community. They worked hand in hand with us. It doesn't happen overnight, and we've been building that for a long time. So that's not an issue. The issue we've got is getting the minds and hearts of these young people now who believe that violence is the answer to everything.
And just a last question, sir. What can folks out there do? What advice do you have for people to stay safe out there right now?
Get involved in a crime watch group in your neighborhood. Care about young people. If you see a young person that you can mentor, a young person you can talk to them. Take the opportunity to, talk to them about violence and making good decisions. You may be able to save someone's life by just talking with them.
Important words right there. Thank you very much to Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Joining me now to discuss the death penalty in South Carolina is Associated Press reporter Meg Kennard. Meg, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Now, Meg, you've been covering the latest on what's going on with the death penalty in South Carolina, including how next Friday the state was set to hold its first execution in more than a decade. That execution was just temporarily put on hold, which we'll get to, but take us through how we got to this point right now where the state is back on track to hold executions again.
As you noted, it has been more than a decade since South Carolina utilized its death penalty. That's an involuntary pause that was pretty much due to the state being unable to procure lethal injection drugs, the trifecta that is used to put inmates to death by lethal injection. In South Carolina, there had been the choice between electrocution or lethal injection. If inmates picked lethal injection and there weren't any drugs, that pretty much meant that they couldn't be executed. That made for the revival of a debate of adding a method to the South Carolina protocols for execution. And last year, it was debated that that be the firing squad option. That caused a lot of kerfuffle in the legislature and across the state. But that was approved by the legislature last year and signed into law by Governor Henry McMaster. The proposal was put forward by two former prosecutors who are legislators, one Republican, Greg Hembry, and one Democrat, Dick Harpootlian, who said that if we're going to have the death penalty in South Carolina, perhaps it should be through a more humane option. And to him, he said that that could be the firing squad. There were two inmates last summer who were set to be executed, but courts put a stay in place on both of their executions because there wasn't yet a firing squad actually set up in the state. And so fast forward to this year, where the State Department of Corrections has instituted its firing squad. They put out protocols and memos about how they intend to carry out executions by firing squad. And most recently, we have had several inmates come up through the end of their appeals. And one of them, Richard Moore, did choose firing squad as his option of execution. As you note, that is on a stay right now while he pursues legal challenges. But here again in South Carolina, this is the current moment for the death penalty.
Yeah, they have that option between electrocution and the firing squad at this point. A lot of them opting for the firing squad, of course, like you said. And that's newly added, like you said, as well. Where do we rank in states that still have the death penalty on the books when it comes to firing squad? You don't really hear about that method being used very often.
There are 24 states across the country that currently have the death penalty in use. South Carolina now is one of only 4 with a firing squad option. There are about 8 that have electrocution, and then the rest of the states have lethal injection as their primary method. But in the modern era, as we call it, of the death penalty since 1976, there have been more than 1,500 executions by various methods across the state. It's been in decline, though, in recent decades. Last year, across the country, there were only 11 executions total, none of which in South Carolina, and 3 of those were at the federal level. But if you go back a decade before that, in 2011, there were 43 executions across the country, one of those here in South Carolina. So there's a lot of debate occurring about whether these methods should be used at all, but certainly the practice has been going down in recent decades.
And a lot of that fueled by the inability to get those drugs, like you said, that cocktail of drugs for lethal injection executions.
There's been a lot of trouble for states trying to procure all of these different drugs, with drug companies saying, we know why you want them, and that's why we won't sell them to you. There are various debates about whether you should have a law in place to shield the names of the companies providing these drugs. That's been debated here in South Carolina as well. But regardless of what measures are put in place, we still here in South Carolina have not been able to get them. And so that prompted, therefore, the debate on adding different methods to the execution protocols.
Meg, you just talked about Richard Bernard Moore, who was set to be executed on April 29th. That's been granted a stay by the state Supreme Court. Tell us this process right now, where these appeals are, what the other avenues are for his appeal in this ongoing process.
Richard Moore has exhausted his habeas, so that means the regular type appeals that you see when an inmate is condemned to death. They can put forth several different legal challenges just based on their execution and their conviction and their sentence, rather. But for Richard Moore, his lawyers are also pursuing challenges to the execution methods here in South Carolina, their constitutionality, as well as a potential petition for him before the U.S. Supreme Court. These are things that we anticipate seeing, particularly when there's a new protocol like firing squad added to a state's methods of execution. Those are all still pending, and so we await those decisions.
So next steps, we're just really waiting for these courts to decide. Do we have any idea what that timeline might look like? Anything we can look back to the past and say 2 weeks, a month, or several months from now?
It could be any of those, all of the above. The state Supreme Court, when they issued the stay of execution for Richard Moore, said that they would provide more details later as to their reasoning. And so it's whatever's in those details. His attorneys will be combing through them and then perhaps transforming those into part of his ongoing legal challenges.
And it's not just Richard Moore who is set to be executed in the state. We just saw on the same day that stay was ordered, the South Carolina Department of Corrections announced that they've given notice to death row inmate Brad Keith Sigmon that his execution date is May 13th. So I'm assuming we're going to expect the same situation that we're seeing with Richard Moore as well happen with Brad Sigmon, sorry.
Certainly. And Brad Sigmund was one of those 2 inmates last summer whose executions were set and then put off while the firing squad was still being put together. There are 35 inmates, all men, currently on South Carolina's death row at various stages of exhausting their appeals. So again, when those appeals run out, that's when we see the state Supreme Court act and issue orders of execution. Depending on where the other inmates are at the stages in the process of their own appeals, we could see more orders coming. I will note that it is not unusual to see these appeals, even at the very last minute, go on and on. There was one execution that I covered that was carried out right before midnight, which would have been the expiration of the order of execution, because there were still ongoing appeals being considered at various levels of courts.
So a very much fluid situation that we're still watching with you as you report this. And folks know that South Carolina has had somewhat of a disturbing past when it comes to the death penalty, most notably the execution of 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. back in 1944. That's a case that really has come back up and again over the past few years, especially as we discuss these execution methods, and especially since he's been exonerated 70 years later after his death. Can you kind of talk to us about that story and how that fits into this narrative right now?
George Stinney, at age 14, was the youngest person to be executed in the United States during the last century. He was convicted after a one-day trial of killing 2 white girls here in South Carolina. His case has been pointed to over the decades as, some would argue, a miscarriage of justice, both for the swiftness with which his execution was carried out, but also bringing up questions about potentially executing innocent people who were not actually guilty of the crimes of which they were convicted. At the time, witnesses described how George Stinney's body was so small that the straps for the electric chair didn't really fit him. And it has been pointed to a lot over the years, particularly as debates over the death penalty come back up, as kind of a stark difference of both how Black people in South Carolina were treated and perhaps wrongfully convicted and executed, but also the death penalty overall. And should these methods even be part of our state's laws and part of the way that justice is meted out? Again, as you note, his conviction was thrown out in 2014 by a judge who noted that there was something in place at the time. She cited coram nobis, which is essentially a law that means that a case was handled so poorly at the time by the authorities that there's no remedy to fix it. And so it all needs to be thrown out. That's what happened in his case, but it is often referenced whenever the death penalty comes back up here in South Carolina.
And I know we we talked about the current situation going on right now in our state with Richard Moore, and there was concerns from his lawyers that this death penalty, this sentence essentially doesn't really fit the crime that he was convicted for, murdering a shopkeeper, but not going in there with the intention of not even having a weapon on him when he went into that convenience store and ended up murdering that shop clerk. How does that mesh, Meg? Do you think that might weigh into any decision about him getting a stay or not, avoiding the firing squad at this point?
A lot of those types of arguments are what come up in inmates' direct appeals when they are challenging their conviction and death sentence in these kinds of cases. As we discussed, those are the appeals that Richard Bernard Moore is out of at this point. And so a lot of the arguments that his attorneys are going to be continuing to make will reference that, but they also need to, from the attorney's point of view, find pieces of the sentence that he's facing and pieces of his case and make new arguments based off of, in their mind, how those don't go together. Again, that has been part of something that they've argued in the past and not won on, but I would anticipate that it will continue to be brought up in his new legal arguments.
And with about 2 minutes, Meg, talk to us about the firing squad in South Carolina. Obviously, it's a new method of execution here. Talk about the composure, how it's going to essentially work out here at Broad River Correctional Institution, where that takes place.
State officials have spent months renovating the death chamber. Now, this is where lethal injection, electrocution, and now firing squad executions all take place in the same room. They had to cut a hole in the brick wall of that chamber so that the volunteer shooters, there will be 3 of them, can point their rifles through the wall at the inmate, the accused, who will sit in the corner across from them. Bullet-resistant glass has also been installed. There's always been a glass wall between the media witnesses like me and the death chamber itself, but they've now reinforced that. And they have also created a new chair, a metal chair into which the inmate will be strapped. one of the strange things about visually how this plays out is the state can't move its electric chair. So it will still be visible, albeit covered, during these other executions should they take place via firing squad. So there have been a lot of renovations, but it's all still going to be in the same death chamber.
And Meg, last question. You've covered these executions before. Tell us the role the media plays in covering these moments.
I've witnessed 7 executions in my role as a reporter for the Associated Press, and we are merely there as a scribe of history to relate to the rest of the world what we see and what we believe to be the sentence of South Carolina being carried out before us. That's it. That's all. So we just say what we see.
Gotcha. Well, we'll be following this case closely as we get ready, apparently, to start executions again in South Carolina. That's Associated Press reporter Meg Kinnard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gavin.
To stay up to date with the latest news throughout the week, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host twice a week that you can find on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.